So I think you all probably have some ideas about this question. Why does nature heal? Why do we feel so good in nature? The first reason we often hear is that, well, it takes us away from our toxic culture, right? There's so much about our culture that does not cause this feeling of spaciousness and timelessness and so on. And there's also a lot that our culture teaches us that's pretty painful. So here are just a few of the messages you might be learning from mainstream culture. That it's not okay to be who you are is one of the bottom lines that we learned very early on. Does anyone identify with any of these as having, yeah, okay. So now we'll look at the more positive aspects of why nature heals, not just that we're getting away from all this toxicity. First is, I think that not only does our culture teach us it's not okay to be who we are, but nature teaches us that it is, that there's nothing wrong with us. Why would I say that? I was walking on a hike a year or two ago, and I saw this beautiful field of wildflowers. This isn't it, by the way. This is from another hike. I didn't have my camera on this one. And they were all yellow, except for one. And the one, it had the same formation as the other flowers. It was clearly the same kind of flower, but it was pink, right? And I didn't say, what's wrong with you? You're sticking out. You're ugly, you don't fit in. I said, how beautiful. That diversity is beautiful. Or you think about when you're walking along and you see this gigantic, majestic tree, thick trunk, big soaring canopy, and you don't think you're too fat. It's gorgeous, right? In fact, it gives us space to be more fully who we are, to see the elements and beings in nature being fully who they are. Someone yelled out earlier that it's timeless. Yeah, we get away from clock time. So if you think about how unnatural clock time is, how unnatural is it to get up at the same 6 a.m. every morning? I mean, the sun might rise at 5:30 or might rise at 7:30, but we're going to get up at 6. Our bodies don't like that, right? How tired you feel when you have to get up and it's still pitch black out. Clock time is rooted in an economic system, not in the rhythms of our body or the rhythms of nature. Our culture is also speeding up. Does anyone remember the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey? Did any of you see that? Where that amazing scene about what it feels like to be weightless in space. It was probably 20 minutes long, that scene. That movie would dive today, right? It's got to be like, well, when we're in nature, we get away from that. And instead, what nature models is organic pace of life. You don't see things growing before your eyes. Even if you're an avid gardener and you check your plants in the morning and then the evening and you can see the change, you don't actually sit there and watch it change, right? It's slow. And the more time we spend in nature, the more we allow ourselves to move at our own natural pace. Now, a caveat, in Boulder, you will see people sprinting up trails with ear pods stuffed in their ears. I'm not talking about those folks. You kind of have to choose to allow nature to slow you down. But if you do, you will. Has anyone ever been on a backpack and it's just rained the entire time? I actually went on a 10-day backpack in the Pacific Northwest and it rained for 6.5 of those days. And I was alone, by the way. This was a solo backpack, so it was an ordeal to get through it. But as you let go of control, this illusion that you can control everything, you actually feel some relief. We're like little kings in our castle when we're at home. We can control when it rains, when the water flows, the streams in our home, right? We can control the temperature. We can control when it's light, when it's dark, when it's windy, when it's not. And if we feel a bad mood coming on, heaven forbid, we can grab a beer or turn on Netflix. This has been talked about. You can't do that in nature, and it's actually relief when you let go of that. When you realize that you're not in control, it's like this burden comes off of your shoulders. Sometimes I wonder what squirrels would be like if they felt that they had to collect enough nuts so that they could retire and then live for 10 or 20 years. Or can you imagine a bear trying to store enough fat that they could hibernate for 20 years of their lives? this thing that we've created, this idea that we have to work as hard as possible right now while we can do it so that we can then just do nothing and then have this crisis of meaning in our retirement, where does that come from? Everything's in balance in nature, and you just don't see people accumulating more than they need, or beings accumulating more than they need. And that's also a relief. It starts to put your priorities in perspective. You start to kind of relax around this idea that you have to get more and more and more and more. So another thing our culture does is try to ignore death. Right? We're terrified of death. We don't like to face that we ourselves are going to die. We don't like to face that all of our loved ones are going to die. When loved ones do not die, it's hard for people around to know how to support because we just don't know how to deal with death in our culture. And that's reinforced by, if you go to a park, there's no death in a park either. All those dead branches, they're taken away, they're manicured away. Nature is not like that. That's part of what makes a wild place wild. There's death everywhere. There's dead trees, there's bones. This was one of my favorite photographs because I love this wildflower, Indian paintbrush. And Indian paintbrush thrives in areas that have experienced wildfire. And so you see in this picture, it's growing out of the dead wood. And you remember as you spend time in nature that death isn't the opposite of life, it's part of life. They're part of an unbreakable whole. And that helps you to prioritize also. Why would I spend 20 years of my life doing something I don't like to do or that stresses me out when I might die the next day? Stillness. I almost don't want to say anything about this. But you know what I mean, right? If you let it, your mind will calm down. Okay, I do want to say something about it. So the first part of my career, I was in a really fast-paced career with various nonprofits, and I eventually decided that wasn't working. I'll get into more of that in a little bit. And so now I'm a psychotherapist, and I also do some spiritual work with people. I'm in private practice. And so I got off the rat race, right? Like I'm a success story, except that the rat race is inside my head still, urging me to go, 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 and you need to get these things in place so that you're going to have enough money and so on. I was walking with my dog the other day and sat down at a pool where he likes to chase ducks and things, and he was doing his thing, and I just sat, and my mind was going like crazy. It's like I hadn't even left the house. I realized that the rat race is internalized. I've internalized it. Just because I've changed the external things in my life, what I do, it's still there, all that conditioning. And as soon as I realized that helped me to relax, and then I could invite the stillness of the pool into me. And it was a shift like that. Nature can do that at any time, but you do have to set an intention. You do have to want to welcome it in. Someone said this, beauty for sure, exhilaration. The beauty in nature is just unbelievable, and you can find it in this backpack I did. This is the Enchanted Valley in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. Or you can also find it in the single flower or in the way a rock glints in a sun. I think beauty is a profoundly healing emotion. And so also are those ones awe and mystery. I was talking to someone at lunch. We talked about how mystery is not really part of the day-to-day in our lives. We're taught we should know everything, right? We should be the experts. It's a sign of weakness to say, I don't know, right? But in nature, you do not know. You don't know how this incredible mountain came to be. And there's also a sense of your own smallness in relation to everything. Like somehow your world shrinks down to proportion. Has anyone had a kind of experience like this where you feel part of this web of life in the natural world? Let me just see. This is another one. As we get closer and closer to the more spiritual experiences people can have in nature, it's harder to talk about, to articulate in words. So words just kind of point, have you experienced that? But one of the ways I like to think about it is, or one of the things that helps me to feel connected is when I realize we all need the same things. Even plants. Plants need sunlight, energy. They need water. They need nutrients. We all need the same things. And we're also connected to realize that as we breathe out, we're breathing out air for the trees. And as we breathe in, we're breathing in the air the trees breathe out. It's amazing to feel how connected we are. Or that we're all made of the same elements, the same kinds of things in our bodies, the same chemical structures. So this next one's my favorite one. You remember who you truly are. And here's where I'm going to talk a little bit about the transition that I took between my first career and my second career. I worked for a number of nonprofits. It was almost like I had a commitment problem. I would work for about a year and a half in the nonprofit, and I'd get burned out, and I'd want to move on. And I looked around, and there were other people who worked there who didn't seem to mind the pace, the urgent pace, or the kind of interpersonal dynamics that can characterize nonprofit work. If maybe you've been in there, you know what I mean. But I kept burning out, and yet it was a career that was meaningful to me. Working for women's rights, independent media, peace, the environment, that's meaning, and that's what I thought mattered, right? Everyone tells you it's important to do something you believe in, and that's true, but it wasn't enough for me. And so I was at my wit's end. So that's when I quit my job, and I took a 10-day solo backpack along a stretch of the Pacific Crest Trail before it was made so popular. And it rained for 6.5 days. And I thought, I'd been exploring spiritual practice at that time. I thought that I would have time to really, connect and kind of bond with nature and journal. And no way. I was just dragging myself to the next campsite, surviving. I was so sore by the last few days that, when I got up from taking a break, it was like staggering. And blisters, the blisters were so bad. So I was just surviving out there. But nature worked its magic anyway. By the end, I learned two things. One is, my life is bound up in nature in a way that I couldn't possibly express behind a computer screen. And the second one is, I remembered who I was. I started to feel like myself again, not all this stress and anxiety and this. I felt like myself, and that self, it was almost like I felt like a little kid again. I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but what I want you to really, we'll just do it in brush strokes. All of us, because of the society we live in, we've created an acceptable self that's okay to present to the world. And then underneath that, we have these, therapists call them personas or subpersonalities. Cognitive scientists might call them neural networks. But they're the kind of programs that have been developed over time to control how we are in society. There's what kind of creates the acceptable self. And so for me, my critical mind is really well honed because I've got a strong academic background. And what do they teach you in school, especially grad school? They teach you to critique and analyze and break apart, not to build, not to create. So that's really well developed in me. And then there's how we see ourselves. And often the how we see ourselves is quite different from the acceptable self. Sometimes we have a pretty bad image of ourselves, right? But what nature does is it reminds us of who we really are, the authentic self. And what I discovered is that my authentic self is wise and it's joyful. It knows what it really wants, what really matters in life. I believe each of us has a purpose, going back to what some of Ushi's beautiful poetry, that we each have gifts to offer to the world. And I think nature can help people discover those. So I'm reaching the end of my talk. If there's 3 things that I'd really love it that you take from it, here they are. A greater awareness of how you feel in nature. Perhaps some greater clarity or understanding of some of the reasons of why you feel that way. And then lastly, this idea that nature helps you to connect more fully with who you really are, with the core you, the authentic you. and that authentic you is wise and joyful and knows what really matters in life and knows what your priorities are. And so therefore that nature is an invaluable ally and teacher and guide in helping you to create the life that you really want. Thanks.